Welcome to Shareholder Primacy from Free Float Media, a podcast about activist investing, securities law, and all the ways the financial and legal worlds intersect and collide in real life. Ann Lipton and I are back again after a break. Ann, of course, is a law professor at the University of Colorado who teaches and researches securities and business law. She holds up the legal end of our podcast.
And that's Mike Levin, an activist investor who lives and works in Chicago. He covers the financial side of our podcast.
Yeah, I should say in the intros that University of Colorado at Boulder, because you live in Boulder now.
No, I live right outside of Boulder.
Right outside of Boulder.
Boulder is very expensive, so I live right outside of Boulder.
You live in a suburb of Boulder, which is a suburb sort of Denver. Anyway, so we're back. We want to say to our followers and fans, thanks for indulging our break. We had a very nice, at least I did. I don't know what you did, Ann. I know you kind of finished moving and all that.
I started teaching.
Did class start this week?
Yes, class started this week, exactly.
Oh, man. Everyone, new set of students, new set of everything.
Yep, figuring out new classroom tech. They have actual blackboards, like real chalk on blackboards, which is very exciting for me. I feel like in Little House on the Prairie.
Oh, wow. None of these electronic kind of like...
Well, not whiteboards. Like, most schools that have whiteboards now, like with markers.
Oh.
And so this has like actual chalkboards. I love it.
Oh, are they new buildings with just old technology that indulges?
No, these are new buildings. I guess somebody aesthetically liked the chalkboard look, which I very much approve.
And then when you're done, the students just take pictures of what was on the board, right?
No, I erase it.
Oh, they don't. They can't do that. Oh, I see. They save it. All right, cool. So welcome back, everybody. Quick reminder: we have our mailbag. That we want, and we're going to cover that a little later today, this morning. Mm-hmm. Just shareholder primacy, one word, at freefloat.llc. Please send us questions, comments, suggestions, love and hate. So that's a quick reminder there. But anyway, let's dig into it. We have a couple of fascinating subjects. One was motivated by one of those mailbag questions about constituency statutes. Sorry. Easy for you to say. Mm-hmm. And those are in some U.S. states and also Canada. We'll dig into that. And then the main event, we'll be talking about Intel, our favorite troubled chip fab company, and their 10% stake that they gave up to the U.S. government or U.S. Treasury. So let's dig into that. Let's talk about constituency statutes, shall we, Ann?
Okay.
I'm going to read the question. The question came from a follower, I think it was a law student. In Canada, who asks, do you think the presence of a constituency statute, editor's note, we'll define that for everyone in a minute, meaningfully changes how the directors of a Canadian issuer or American issuer domiciled in a constituency statute state might approach its duties, particularly when many of the corporation's shareholders presumably are diversified portfolio holders? So, first, can we quickly help me? What's a constituency statute?
It's a statute that explicitly says corporate directors don't have to favor stockholders exclusively. So they say that corporate directors can take the interests of employees or customers or the community into account when they're making corporate decisions. Delaware, notably, does not have such a statute. In Delaware, by common law, directors' fiduciary obligation is to maximize shareholder wealth and prioritize shareholders. But some states have changed that by statute.
So there are some U.S. states, and we're going to bring this to Canada in a minute, and also Canadian, either apparently provincial Canada, or natural law, right, that says that explicitly allows or encourages, but not necessarily require. I don't know.
Not necessarily require, because it's a bunch of different interests. So it's something like directors are free to take these interests into it. Is usually what they're phrased, but they're phrased different ways.
Okay, and so that's in contrast with statutory or case or law that either emphasizes or requires wealth maximization.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's kind of the contrast. So then the question is, does being in a state, or in the case of a Canadian company, a country, where you're allowed to do this, how does that change how you approach your duties? And maybe generally, and then if you're a diversified big index fund, what's your thoughts on that?
I'm thinking of this in terms of the corporate issuer that has diversified fund, that maybe has diversified fund shareholders. Because we talked last time, we talked about Paramount. Or not was last time, 2 times ago. I don't know, whenever it was.
Whatever
we talked about
did,
Paramount and we mentioned diversified shareholders may have different preferences than a shareholder who's like invested in just one company. But okay, so with the caveat that I don't know anything about Canadian corporate law, but I'm just tackling this from a kind of 50,000 foot level.
Yes.
From my perspective, one of the most important things about corporate law, which is actually the part that makes it interesting and fun for me, is that there is a disjunction between the formal obligations that are imposed on directors. Say, you have these fiduciary obligations. Here's what the court says.
Right. Here's care and loyalty or something.
Yeah,
whatever
exactly.
Yes, right.
And how those duties are actually enforced. So we know in Delaware, corporate directors have a fiduciary duty to maximize wealth. Lots of cases say that. But outside of a few very specific scenarios, that duty can't be enforced in a lawsuit. And yet directors do usually act to maximize shareholder wealth. Why? Because of corporate structure. Only the shareholders vote.
Oh, because
corporate
of the
officers are
incentives
paid in
and stuff.
stock.
Yeah, right.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
In a public company, activists can come in like you and say, hey, you're not maximizing shareholder wealth. Which means what matters really isn't the fact that directors formally have this legal duty to maximize wealth. What matters is who exercises power in the company. But it also means if the shareholders who exercise power are diversified, and if they care about issues like, say, climate change, directors are going to respond to that regardless of what their fiduciary obligations are. So that's my reaction to the question. If Canadian directors have a duty, or even just the freedom, to consider non-shareholders, how is that reflected in the corporate structure? Can stakeholders sue to enforce these duties? If not, what are the avenues for stakeholders to exercise power? If the only ones who exercise power are the shareholders, then I think directors at the end are still going to do what shareholders want. And if shareholders genuinely want more consideration of stakeholders, that's what they'll get. And if not, not.
Right.
So in America, and I assume everywhere, the formal content of fiduciary obligation isn't what's doing the work. I mean, what does the work is who has the power.
Okay, so the
my take.
answer here is sort of no, then yes.
Yes.
That no, that the statutory obligation per se does not necessarily lead to this behavior of how you approach your duties, but it's the whole, and maybe it helps like set a tone or set
It might
an
set a
environment
tone.
or
Like there
something.
might be
Yeah,
like,
right.
well, here's the thing. So I'm a lawyer, and sociologists do a lot about organizational behavioral culture and how culture
Right.
sets tones and I believe all that's real, but it's not my field, so I can, from a legal perspective, I just
Right.
tend to put it to the
Right.
side.
So you could say, you read about people, not legal advice. You're going to say this is not sociological advice.
Exactly.
But on the other hand, there could be kind of behavioral, which verges into what I think more about, the economics and so forth, factors that lead to that because of who, as our questioner asks, who the diversified investors might be. Mm-hmm. So that's what kind of leads to, which is actually that seems very sensible to a person like me, that I want the incentives and the behaviors to drive what people do rather than, the pure legal I want those. I mean, because I'm an economist, not a lawyer. I want the legal structure to kind of reflect, what's going to be best for everybody, rather than the other way around.
Right,
So
right. I'm not sure that really goes. That is an accurate. I think
I don't
actually
know
there are
either.
structural problems if we talk about everybody rather than just
right.
shareholders. But I think
Yes.
corporations are really well designed to benefit shareholders. We kind of
Yes.
solved that problem.
Yes. All right. So the answer is probably not or no, but there are other
Maybe,
factors possibly drawing on the constituency statutes that could then lead to the corporations doing what the diversified or index funds or whatever want them to do. Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. I think that's pretty good. Hopefully that answers that question. That was mailbag for the day. So everybody send more. We have a couple in reserve, but we need more. So please send them along. And let's talk about the main event. And that was the main event of the last couple of weeks, which was the U.S. government taking 10% of Intel of California. Intel, of course, is this troubled chip manufacturer that needed sort of a boost from the U.S. government. I can summarize a couple of the really salient facts. Intel has been really dogging it for quite a while. And it's not just like AI chips where NVIDIA is dominant and so forth. Intel's had problems for quite some time. And they're kind of, they're still, making money and so forth, but they're a shadow of what they used to be when we used to call them Wintel, when there was this kind of, computer dominance. They really didn't get into mobility very well and so forth. Anyway, so as with Intel is symbolic of it, but not the only problem, the U.S. passed the CHIPS Act last year, and as part of the CHIPS Act, the U.S. was prepared to basically hand over $10 billion in, I would call it a grant, to Intel to help with investment and create jobs in the U.S. There's this happens all the time. It happens at the state level, happens at the local level, where some governmental body decides to rescue a job-creating company in exchange for, basically promises, sometimes vague promises, sometimes very specific promises to make these investments in infrastructure, in creating a workforce and so forth. So that was sort of the background. And Intel was just kind of going to proudly march ahead, accept the $10 billion, make the investment, and try to turn their business around. But then something happened. I don't know whether President Trump got the idea on his own or whether someone, Nelson Peltz, one of his friends, was whispering in his ear. And, Intel's been the subject of a little bit of activism over the years, not anything too huge. And somebody said, you ought to get more. Either somebody said or it occurred to President Trump on his own, you ought to get more than just a bunch of jobs. Right. So and I didn't read, there's been a couple of really great accounts. The Wall Street Journal had a really, really good kind of play-by-play, TikTok, of how this happened, how this went down, and how the CEO kind of saved his job. And, there's also just social media where, for at one moment, Donald Trump was crapping all over the guy. And then after they closed this deal.
You were saying he was loyal to China and not the U.S.
Yeah, right, exactly. There was going to be an investigation that he was committing industrial espionage. And then, the next week is, oh man, he's an American hero. But that all revolved around what amounts to Intel, I don't know if it's granting, I don't know what the right verb would be, but conveying 10% of its common shares.
9.9%.
9.9, sorry. Okay, I was wrong. To the U.S. government. I had thought it was to the Treasury, but I think you said it was
Commerce. Commerce. It's Department of Commerce.
The Department of Commerce is the record holder on the company books of this almost 10% of shares. And that was basically in consideration for the funding.
Yep.
I think so. If you weren't like paying close attention to the politics, you would view this as an investment of $10 billion in exchange for 10% of the shares, which valued the company at about $100 billion, which I think was pretty close to what it's
a little bit low. They're getting a slight discount.
Yeah, right. But it wasn't like this unbelievably sweetheart deal, and the U.S. government, our company, didn't overpay. So that's kind of the facts on the ground. I don't think I missed anything really significant there, did I? No? All right, good. But there's been all sorts of really interesting debate about what in fact actually happened here, like from a securities law and a corporate governance and an investment perspective. And that's, I think, what we would like to delve into a little bit here. Is that right? Mm-hmm. So let's first talk about the share. There's a share sale agreement, right?
Yes, there's
I don't know what
contract.
It's entitled. There's a contract. What's in that contract, Ann?
Okay, as you said, Intel was previously slated to get these grants, but to be specific, it was actually two separate segments. One was called the Direct Funding Agreement, and that required Intel to get to invest in very specific plants in particular states like Ohio and Arizona, and it was going to invest in those plants and build them out. That was the Direct Funding Agreement. And then separately, there was another pot of funding called the Secure Enclave Agreement, where Intel was going to manufacture chips in the U.S. so that they'd be available for national security. So it was actually these two separate pots of money. And Intel was slated to receive that money. It had a contract with the Biden administration that was going to get this money. And now, under this new agreement, as you say, it gets the exact same money, but it has to give up 9.9% of its stock. Now, in this contract, it says Intel has the exact same obligations it always had under the Secure Enclave Agreement, which is the national security piece. But under the Direct Funding Agreement, the one that's about investing in particular plants in the U.S., the new agreement says with this grant, Intel is released from further obligations under that agreement. Now, I don't know, like I haven't been able to tell whether that really means that Intel is like doesn't have to upgrade those facilities or do whatever, or whether it pretty much was going to do that anyway. And this is just cleanup. Like I actually can't tell. I know that Intel hadn't finished making whatever investments it was going to make. So I just don't know like what the impact of that is, but definitely it says that Intel is now released from all obligations under the Direct Funding Agreement. Anyway, so the U.S. pays the Intel the same amount of money, and now it gets this stock that it's priced at $20 per share, which is just like a little bit below like where it was valued. Right. And there's a voting agreement. The Department of Commerce has to vote with the Intel board unless the matter specifically concerns this agreement or Intel's relationship with the government. So if Intel's board proposes we should renounce this agreement, Commerce gets to vote against the board there. But otherwise, Commerce has to vote with Intel's board. And Commerce can sell the stock that it gets, but it can't do it before August 26, 2026. So, like, that's the date that the stock is released for sale. And if it sells, it has
there's a standstill.
Yeah, there's a standstill. But if it sells, it has to do so in a broadly syndicated offering. They obviously don't want Commerce placing it with one big block with an activist. And finally, Intel has this foundry segment, and you probably know more about it than I do, but apparently it does manufacturing for outside customers, and there's been a lot of debate about whether it's useful to Intel. So there obviously was some risk that it was going to get rid of this segment. So the agreement says, that if within the next 5 years, Intel sells more than 49% of that business, the U.S. gets to buy another 5% more of Intel stock at the same price, $20 per share. So that's basically the agreement itself.
So let's talk for a minute about the voting agreement, just to make sure we've covered that. So the U.S. government owner, Howard Lutnick, maybe he holds the proxy. I don't know. He's the Secretary of Commerce. So they agreed to vote on all board recommended matters. So like they're going to vote for all the Intel director nominees. And if there's a
shareholder proposal, they're going to vote as the board recommends.
Pay. You're right.
Yeah,
Who the auditor is. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's a fairly customary voting agreement. And again, the U.S. government, the owner, is locked up for a year. On its terms. So we'll sort of see what happens. So is there any sunset to this? Is there any so the U.S. government could be a 10% owner of Intel for the next 5, 10, 15 years?
Yeah, I don't think it ever expires. It's just about if and when they sell.
Okay, interesting. All right, so what's a couple of these things just blow me away. But what blows you? What's weird or odd or what's crazy about this for you?
Well, I mean, obviously, we just have the whole premise where the U.S. is taking stake in a private company, and also the idea that there was a grant. They were supposed to just get a grant, and now suddenly the Trump administration is changing the deal and saying, okay, you get the grant, but only if you give us stock unilaterally. There was a grant. It was like there was an act. There was an act of Congress, and Trump just changed it. So, like, leaving that aside, I mean, we haven't seen the U.S. take stakes in private companies outside of like emergency situations like the financial crisis. So the agreement comes with all these risk warnings about the business aspects, but also the legal risks of this kind of contract. Like it might just go up in smoke if the government changes its policies, and it might turn out to be unenforceable, which seriously, like think about how do you enforce this? Suppose, despite the voting agreement, Commerce votes against Intel's board. What can Intel do? The agreement itself requires any claims be brought in the District of Columbia or the Court of Federal Claims. So it's not going to Chancery. Do you think the Court of Federal Claims...
Or it's not going to Federal District Court.
No, well, yeah, it could go to the District of Columbia or the Court of Federal Claims.
But
which is different.
Which is different than...
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Go
yeah,
ahead.
But there'll be there'll be a statutory requirement, and I don't know enough about jurisdiction in these matters to be able to say which one is the which. But do we expect one of those courts to issue an injunction requiring Commerce to vote the shares a particular way? I have no idea. So that's one thing. And then there's the escrow. Remember, there are these two separate pots of money here: the direct funding agreement and the secure enclave agreement. For the secure enclave agreement, Intel said it's going to put the shares in escrow and release them incrementally as the funding comes in. So for the secure enclave agreement, funding is going to come in over time, and Intel is going to release the shares over time. But the whole arrangement only lasts while Intel is eligible for secure enclave funding. I'm not exactly sure how long that is, but it might be like 10 years or something. Once that period ends, so Intel is no longer eligible for the secure enclave funding, if the government hasn't paid what's due, it still gets half the shares in escrow. No questions asked. The rest are canceled and it gets half. So theoretically, the government could just not disperse anything, wait it out, and get half the shares anyway.
Oh, and that would be something that wouldn't shock me if this current administration pulled some sort of crap like that. Right. Okay.
But the final thing, and this was just reported this morning, it's not in the agreement, but it was reported this morning that Intel had been donating money to a historically black educational institution.
Oh, HBCUs, yeah, right.
Yeah,
right.
A law school, and essentially to create a diverse pipeline of lawyers that it could then hire, and it stopped that funding. Now, that's not in the agreement, but you do have to wonder whether they did it as part of the agreement nonetheless.
Yeah, there might be some sort of kind of wink and a nod, some sort of an understanding that this is a way for this 10% shareholder to kind of influence
exert a little bit of influence,
sort of an anti-woke, anti-ESG effort. A more significant version of that.
Yeah.
So wow. All right. So, yeah, I mean, what I was actually not completely taken aback. I mean, by this happening, and I was, as an investor, and again, I used to own Intel a long time ago. I don't anymore. I was a little reassured, I suppose, that there was like a voting agreement and so forth. That that they thought enough about this to paper it up a little more, and the papering up starts to look a little like what other 10% investments might look like in a company. This is kind of like a pipe when you think about it, okay? And it looks a little like other pipe terms, with commitments to support the board and so forth.
Right.
But what I was worried about, and we're going to talk about that a little later, maybe after the break, was what some of the other kind of influences would look like. This was not merely, some sort of equity analyst deep buried in commerce said, hey, we ought to invest 10% in this chip maker. This is, and we're going to make a decent risk-adjusted return on the free cash flow and so forth. This was, our president saying, we're going to give these people $10 billion. We should get more than just some jobs. And again, it was very, very transactional in that way.
Yeah.
And so I kind of worried what else.
It was reported that Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren did want equity when the CHIPS Act passed.
This isn't the first time this has come up.
But they was rejected.
Interesting. All right. Well, so that was. That was some of what I was kind of wondering or maybe concerned or surprised by was how the federal government would view this kind of sort of investment and what it was going to get out of it. Again, other than jobs. Most of the time this happens, it's job creation.
Yeah, exactly. That's
but there's more to it, I think, in this one than just that. Anyway, there are some other really cool questions we can cover. I suggest let's take a quick break.
Okay.
And then we can return to some of those and then talk about some of the more broader investment thesis implications for this investment. How about we do that, okay?
Sounds good.
All right, let's do that, and we will return to Intel momentarily here at Shareholder Primacy.
Shareholder Primacy is brought to you by FreeFlowAnalytics.com, the only free database of corporate directors, their influence, and their performance. If you own a stock or retirement plan, go to FreeFlowAnalytics.com and look up which of your elected directors are performing well and which aren't. Use your vote in the alternative democracy and get your data at FreeFlowAnalytics.com. Now, back to the show.
Welcome back to Shareholder Primacy. I'm Ann Lipton here with Mike Levin. So we were talking about Intel and this
Yes.
this
crazy
unusual
deal.
arrangement. Yes.
Yeah, I have a couple more questions that we should try to cover. The 10% of the shares were just kind of, I said this was a pipe.
Yes.
So there wasn't any kind of shareholder. What kind of approval process does this have to go through where shareholders can sort of bless this, or maybe none, or what's going
Absolutely
on?
none. So this is really
Okay.
So I am very much on social media, probably too much so, and this was constantly coming up, even from lawyers, just like not corporate governance lawyers who just don't understand how corporate law works. So the fact is, no, it does not require any shareholder approval. That's normal. The company can just so the charter of every company authorizes the maximum number of shares that can issue, and as long as the board stays below that maximum number, they can decide when to issue shares and on what terms to issue shares. They only need a shareholder vote legally to authorize it. In very specific scenarios that the exchanges require. So under state law...
Oh, it's a listing requirement,
exactly.
Of course, yes.
Under state law, there's no requirement of shareholder approval to issue shares as long as you're below the maximum. Under federal exchange listing rules, sometimes you need approval for very specific share issuances, like if you're going to issue more than 20% of your stock.
I think that's a NASDAQ rule,
Both
isn't
of them.
it?
Both of them.
Oh,
have,
both?
they're
Okay,
similar.
yeah, right.
If you're going to issue more than 20%, you need shareholder approval. And as we talked about in the context of Tesla, if you're going to have a new equity compensation plan for your directors and officers, then you need shareholder approval. But just to place 10% with an investor, any investor, this is a board decision, and
even if it's the federal government.
Yes.
You know. I mean, and there are probably I haven't talked to Intel shareholders. There are many that are probably, or many, a few at least, that are deeply upset. Not only did Intel, I'm sure they're probably happy for the $10 billion. Intel needed the money.
Yeah. But they were supposed to get it anyway.
Right. Yeah, they were supposed to get it anyway, and so giving this up to, Howard Lutnick and Donald Trump and the Department of Commerce and the U.S. government probably upset them. So they were probably wondering, why didn't I have any say in this? And it's because you
just don't.
you wouldn't. And so there's really no actionable item.
Well,
I mean, you can't
someone
could sue somebody, but I don't know how far you get.
Well, exactly. I mean, like Delaware, and Intel is incorporated in Delaware. Delaware draws a distinction between like what you are statutorily authorized to do and then what would be a breach of fiduciary duty to do. Like the board has discretion to place 10% of the shares, however it wants to, whether it complied with its fiduciary obligations when exercising that discretion is a different question. So that's that's the next step. Like, okay, fine. They are legally allowed to just issue shares, but did they comply with their fiduciary obligations in doing so? Because what they certainly couldn't do is just give 10% of the shares to someone for free and just say, here, God bless, I want to hand you 10% of the company.
Right. Yes, that would be like gifting or something. That
would be waste. That would be a breach of fiduciary duty. So we saw lots of people like saying, how can they just give it? Because they were supposed to get the money anyway. Right. But here's the thing. From another point of view, they didn't just give it away. So first of all, they got that lift of obligations for the direct funding agreement. And I'm genuinely not sure whether that's any substantive release of obligations.
It matters,
but,
right? Yeah.
But the other thing is, yes, they were supposed to get the money regardless. But the reality was the Trump administration was withholding it. If you go back to their SEC filings, like for the last couple filings, they actually said, we've met the requirements, but we have no idea whether we're actually going to get the money.
Oh, so, right. So they were like any academic, any other grantee was just kind of waiting, and we hoping, we need this dough.
So
Yeah, right.
maybe Intel could have sued, I don't know, but that would have taken a very long time. The outcome wasn't certain. They would piss off the Trump administration, which, is particularly vengeful.
You don't want to do that, right?
So I think from a pure shareholder welfare perspective, it's at least reasonable to think that the easiest path was just to agree to give up the stock and get the money
10%,
amicably.
right. A little 10% dilution in exchange for this.
And this is kind of like the situation. Yeah, it's just like the situation we've got universities in now, right? And that they're supposed to get these grants, but the litigation is long and uncertain, and it's easier to just settle. I've seen some suggest this was all, and you mentioned this, that this is a way of saving the CEO's job, that this is all just like a conflicted transaction to save the CEO's job. But even if you view it that way, he's just one member of the board. And if the other board members approved, they're not conflicted. And so that's majority independent board approval. It cleanses all the conflicts. Plus, you can see some other benefits to Intel. So one of them is just, well, now they've got essentially a powerful champion. The U.S. government wants to see them profit, and the U.S. government has a lot of
levers to make that happen. And they kind of did before.
Happen.
They kind of did before. Commerce would normally be a cheerleader for this kind of stuff,
but now they
got a real motivated investor here.
And also, you mentioned Intel has been the target of some activism. So from their perspective, this is kind of like an activist defense. I mean, you can think of this as like, first of all, there's this soft version of it, which is no activists just want to buck the Trump administration. But then, even if someone did, 10% of the votes are locked up.
Oh yeah, no, yeah. If I was an activist looking at Intel now, I would count. And I haven't looked lately, but Intel was not, very well held by the insiders. I think it was 3 or 4%. I can't remember. It was decent, but not relative to other huge companies. But now there's 10-15% is held by insiders. That's a huge barrier to any kind of activist work at a company of this size.
Yeah, So then that leads to the next, as I spin this out in my head, the next question, which is it a breach of duty to essentially create a little activist defense? By handing over 10% of the company.
I wish it were.
Yeah, I wish it were. But yeah, exactly. Because in Delaware, a sale, if you sell shares, normally that's just an ordinary business transaction. Right. But if you distribute shares for a takeover defense, like in the context of a poison pill, that actually would get heightened scrutiny if someone sues over it. But Delaware has said, just because a share sale also happens to have the collateral effect of protecting against activists, doesn't mean that every single share sale is treated as a takeover defense. If the main reason of the sale is to sell the shares, that's just an ordinary business decision. And that's really what this looks like. But I do want to mention with the voting agreement, I mean, you said it's pretty standard, because on the one hand, you can see, I mean, no one wants to hand 10% of the stock over to someone who might then vote them out of office. So they definitely...
no one does that. Nobody... No board settles one of these things.
Yeah, exactly. Without
only to give the shareholder free rein to oppose them anyway.
But what they could have done though is, instead of saying Commerce has to vote with the board, they could have done it as a mirror voting. So that it's not so much that Commerce has to vote with the board, Commerce has to vote the exact same way that other shareholders vote. Yeah. That way, so that if the shareholders vote 70-30 in favor of something, then Commerce would vote 70-30 in favor. And that way, and that would be a completely neutral thing. We're selling shares to Commerce or giving shares to Commerce, but we're completely neutral on activism. So it wasn't really necessary to sneak in this kind of activist events. But still, 10% is just not big in the grand scheme of these things, and I just don't think a court would really look at it.
And that neutrality term is much less common.
Yeah, of course it is. Because if you can get the defense, why wouldn't you?
Right, but there would be some sort of a logic to that, because if we're not talking about some sort of sharky hedge fund or something like that, or PE firm. We're talking about the federal government. We're talking about a fund representing 350 million taxpayers.
It should be neutral, but nonetheless, they just don't have the way. But I will say this, because this, again, on social media, especially because I'm on Blue Sky, it's a very lefty space, and people were up in arms about this, and can shareholders sue? I'm I don't think they're going to be successful in a suit, but what they could do is seek books and records.
I would love to sort of see.
Now, I mean,
that what happened here.
you could, if you were, if you're sure to tell, you probably could ask for this. Now, of course, Delaware changed its law. You'd be very unlikely to get like emails and the good stuff,
Right,
and probably,
right.
I assume the board materials are pretty like heavily
Pretty
lawyered,
vanilla.
but
Yeah, right.
but they still might yield a nugget.
Yeah, some journalist, instead of doing a FOIA, that's the thing. That's the next frontier for journalists.
Yeah,
Instead
own
of
stock.
FOIAs, you go buy a share of stock.
Yeah,
and
but you have
submit
to
it
demonstrate
at
some kind of
220.
shareholder purpose, and unfortunately,
Yeah, invest because I have a story to write. Anyway, all right. So there's some interesting kind of broader kind of investment oriented implications.
yeah. So like
I
from an
suppose,
investor,
here.
so that's like
Yeah.
how I think of this legally. How do you think of this as an investor?
It at the same time, as I hinted before, it kind of bothers me, but it doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't bother me. Again, Intel needs the money.
Yeah.
And no sane investor is going to invest, $10 billion in a pipe without getting something for it.
Right.
Okay. Whether 10% was fair, whether, whether Intel could have negotiated harder and, gotten it down to 7. I don't know how much negotiation happened here. That's one of the subjects of the 220 demand that we're going to see one of these days. But pipes are pretty standard. The idea that it's the federal government on the other side of it is pretty unconventional. And again, this is not uncommon. Berkshire does this with some frequency. Take a troubled company that's has some fairly desperate needs, has the liquidity. The federal government certainly has the liquidity to do this. I mean, they're the ultimate source of liquidity. They could have printed the $10 billion. They didn't have to go, track it down. They didn't have to go cash in some sort of investment in order to create the money. Okay. Furthermore, there's been lots of other government bailouts. The government bailed out the auto industry.
But
I understand. It was a little different. That was in the form of debt. That was not in the form of equity.
Well, no, it's not just that. It's that they were supposed to get the money anyway.
Well, yeah, this is true. So it was sort of a bailout. And again, I would love to know, in the boardroom, they're getting ready. Okay, where's our money? You just a little while ago you said, they're kind of waiting on the funding, and then they're saying, okay, we're about to get the funding, but we have to give out 10%.
Yeah.
Where'd that come from? That would have been a really interesting moment in the boardroom. So anyway, the idea of a bailout or of this kind of investment, doesn't. It troubles me a little bit. I wish they didn't need it, and I would want them to have negotiated this. As hard as they could have. But again, there may have been limits to that too. Again, we're dealing with a counterparty here that I think from a negotiating standpoint is pretty irrational. And there was, there's no predicting, what, and normally if you're negotiating a pipe, you don't have to worry if the negotiation goes south that you're going to end up all over Truth Social and with the CEO even deeper crap than they were before.
Right.
But anyway, so those are a couple comments. Now, let's talk about the counterparty here. This investor. Normally, if this, like I said, if it's Berkshire, even if I wouldn't necessarily worry. But the counterparty here is uniquely weird.
Yeah.
Okay. Again, as we said earlier, there wasn't some equity analyst in a back room saying this is a good. I've looked at cash flows and this is a good idea. Okay. This is the U.S. president and potentially some of his advisors saying, what can we get out of this? Maybe not. Maybe they were just saying we should get more than just jobs. Or maybe they were saying, we need, I've been thinking a lot about Intel and their DEI programs, which are on the way out. Or I've been thinking about where they invest. Should they be building a plant in Texas or in Alabama, someplace where the president would like to do someone a favor? Okay. I'm concerned about the kind of meddling that this investor would do that has nothing to do with improving cash flows and raising the share price.
Right.
Okay, there's no share price trigger here. There's nothing. There was that one little component about the foundry business, but there's nothing about how the federal government's trying to make money off of its 10%.
Yeah,
I'm highly confident they did not analyze what this is going to look like in 5 years. Okay.
Yeah. Well,
so therefore,
Trump's out of office in 5 years.
I mean, there was I think the New York Times had the headline, Trump is the new activist.
Yes, I saw
Like
that. Yes.
that. And it totally made me cringe because, most active, the things I work on are trying to create value for a company. He was just trying to, potentially create trouble.
Yeah.
So the other thing that I was kind of wondering about is that, the Intel, already does, I mean, they sell internationally, but most of their assets are in the U.S. Okay, I think they have some plants overseas, but and all the investments they do are here. Okay, so there's very little additional, marginal additional investing they could do that's going to be accretive, that is going to kind of satisfy this investor. So on the one hand, 10% is not going to, it's enough to kind of thwart, routine activist stuff, but it's not going to be enough to kind of dominate, some sort of shareholder vote. Well, but it does, and again, the voting, what was gratifying. What was good is that this 10% didn't get, Howard Lutnick on the board. Mm-hmm. That sometimes happens, in exchange for a 10% stake. It didn't give him board observer rights. It's just so there's some things where I don't know if this came up. My guess is that Trump basically said, just let's get something for this more than just jobs. Yeah. And so, Intel may have said, well, what do you think about 10%? Let's take 5% off the share price. This is your shares, and that's it. My concern, I don't have a lot as an investor. I wouldn't have very specific concerns, but there's so many different ways this can go south.
Yeah.
For Intel that are so unpredictable. Right. So, at some point, if the sooner they can redeem this, the better. How's that sound?
Yeah.
So you do not want this activist, hanging around, any longer than you absolutely need.
So basically, they'll be really happy after 2026 when the commerce can sell.
when commerce can sell this stake. So hopefully they've, got a 20% share price bump. Things recover. They unlock the key to AI chips, and in a year and a half, commerce has moved on. Or maybe President's short attention span has helped him to migrate to some new subject. Anyway,
maybe.
So that's the some observations about this from the investor standpoint. So okay. Anyway, well, that was kind of fun. I had followed some of the Intel story, but was kind of eager to hear some of the legal perspective that I knew that you could really, really kind of penetrate. Yeah. Shall we conclude? How's that
Makes
sound?
sense. Sure.
All right, let's do that. Thanks, Ann. It's great talking about all this stuff always. We will continue with this at some point. We'll sort of see in a year whether we've how the investment works out. We're back with a series of podcasts for the fall, so please stay tuned here at Shareholder Primacy, hosted by Ann Lipton and me, Mike Levin. I'm an independent activist investor, an advisor to investors about their activist situations. Ann is the professor of law and the Lawrence W. Demuth Chair of Business Law at the University of Colorado Law School at Boulder. Remember, it's in Boulder. You can find me, Mike, at theactivistinvestor.com and Ann at lawweb, one word, .colorado.edu. Our podcast is produced and distributed by Free Float Media. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk again soon.